Dad forced me into a mental institution to steal my money. Said, "You're not fit to manage it." I gathered every piece of evidence, got released, and sued him for abuse. He lost everything, and I made sure he can never see me again. I never imagined my own father would betray me like this. It's still hard to wrap my head around everything that happened. I'm writing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe, just maybe, it'll stop someone else from going through the same nightmare. Let me start from the beginning. I grew up in Wichita Falls, Texas. It's one of those towns where everybody thinks they know you, but they only see what's on the surface. To everyone else, my family looked perfect. My dad, Roderick, or Rod as most people called him, was a charming guy. He was the type of man who could sell ice to an Eskimo. At church, he'd shake hands, make small talk, and everyone thought he was just the nicest guy. They didn't know the real him. At home, Rod was different. He was controlling, strict, and had this way of making you feel like you were constantly walking on eggshells. My mom, Eloise, was quiet and submissive. She never stood up to him, not once that I can remember. And me? I was the kid who stayed in my room as much as possible, trying not to draw attention to myself. Growing up, I knew Rod liked control. He was the type of man who had to be in charge of everything, from what we ate for dinner to how we spent our weekends. But I never thought he'd go as far as he did. When I turned 18, my grandma passed away and left me a sizable inheritance, about $150,000. It was the most money I'd ever seen in my life, and I had big plans for it. I wanted to go to college, study accounting, and eventually start my own business. I was careful with my money too. I kept it in a separate account, one that only I had access to. At least, that's what I thought. At first, Rod acted like he was proud of me. He'd say things like, "You're smart, Cass. You're going to do great things." But then the questions started. "How much do you have saved now? Are you sure you don't want me to help you invest it? Do you even know what to do with that kind of money?" I told him I had it under control, but he didn't like that answer. The more I resisted his advice, the more frustrated he got. He started saying things like, "You're not mature enough to handle that kind of responsibility," and "You're going to blow it all on stupid things." I told him I wasn't interested in his help, and that's when the mood in the house shifted. He started picking fights with me over the smallest things, leaving a dish in the sink, forgetting to take out the trash, even the way I spoke to him. It was like he was looking for any excuse to make me feel small. I started noticing little things that didn't add up. For one, I'd see envelopes with my name on them sitting on the kitchen counter, only for them to disappear later. I asked Rod about it once, and he just laughed and said, "You're imagining things." Then, one day, I logged into my bank account and noticed something strange. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize. Small amounts at first, $20 here, $50 there. But over time, the numbers started getting bigger. $500. $1,000. I panicked and confronted Rod. "What's going on with my account? Did you take money from me?" He didn't even flinch. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Cashin, you're losing it. You're not in a good place right now. You've been acting paranoid for weeks." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him I wasn't crazy, but he just shrugged it off like I didn't know what I was talking about. A week later, it all came crashing down. I woke up to two strangers standing in my bedroom. They weren't cops, but they weren't random people either. They introduced themselves as mental health professionals. "Cashin, your father called us," one of them said. "He's worried about your mental health." I laughed nervously, thinking this had to be some kind of sick joke. "What? I'm fine. I don't need help." They didn't budge. "Your father says you've been exhibiting paranoid behavior and making accusations that don't make sense. We need to take you to a facility for evaluation." I froze. "Wait, what? No. I'm not crazy. Dad." Rod walked in, calm as ever. "Cass, this is for your own good," he said. "We're worried about you." I begged him to stop, pleaded with him to listen to me, but he didn't care. The strangers, let's call them what they were, enforcers, escorted me out of the house and into a van. The facility was 2 hours away in Fort Worth. It was a psychiatric hospital, and the second I walked in, I felt like I'd been dropped into a nightmare. The walls were stark white, the lights were too bright, and everything smelled like antiseptic. They took my phone, my wallet, and my dignity. The staff treated me like I was broken. They'd ask me questions like, "Do you hear voices?" or "Do you feel like someone's watching you?" No matter how much I insisted I was fine, they'd nod like they didn't believe me. I found out later that Rod had told them I was delusional, hearing voices, and making accusations that didn't make sense. He'd also conveniently gained temporary power of attorney while I was in treatment. I tried to keep track of time, but the days started blending together. They put me on medications I didn't need, claiming they'd help stabilize my mood. All they did was make me feel foggy and disconnected. I kept thinking about my bank account, my money, and what Rod might be doing while I was stuck in there. One day, I met Dr. Miriam Calder, a psychologist at the facility. She was different from the others. She actually listened to me. "Cashin, tell me what's really going on," she said during one of our sessions. I broke down and told her everything, the inheritance, the withdrawals, the way my dad had been treating me. She didn't interrupt or look at me like I was crazy. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, her face serious. "Something doesn't add up," she said. She started looking into my case and found inconsistencies in the reports my dad had provided. She also noticed that I didn't exhibit any of the symptoms he'd claimed I had. "You're not crazy, Cashin," she told me. "But we need evidence to prove it." Dr. Calder helped me reach out to a lawyer, a family friend named Quentin, who started building a case. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and played along with the staff so they wouldn't suspect I was planning anything. It took weeks, but eventually, we gathered enough evidence to challenge my commitment. When I was finally released, Rod didn't see it coming. That's where things started to change. When I was released, the first thing I did was go straight to Quentin's office. He had everything ready, bank records, testimonies from the facility, and even evidence from Dr. Calder's investigation that proved my dad had lied to get me institutionalized. I was still reeling from everything that had happened, but I was clear on one thing: I wasn't going to let Rod get away with it. Quentin explained the plan. We were going to file a lawsuit against my dad for fraud, financial abuse, and wrongful commitment. On top of that, we'd press criminal charges for theft. The goal wasn't just to get my money back, it was to make sure he paid for what he did. The case hit him like a freight train. Rod thought he was untouchable, but he wasn't ready for what was coming. Quentin worked fast. First, we got the bank records that showed Rod had been transferring money from my account into his over the past year. He'd tried to be sneaky, taking small amounts at first, but the larger withdrawals were impossible to miss. We also found out he'd used my money to pay off his own debts, credit cards, car payments, even some shady investment schemes that had tanked. Then, we gathered evidence from the facility. Dr. Calder provided a detailed report about my mental health and how there was no justification for my commitment. She even found inconsistencies in the paperwork my dad had submitted to have me institutionalized. He'd exaggerated or outright lied about my behavior to get the doctors to sign off. We also dug into his power of attorney. Turns out, he'd forged my signature on some documents to gain access to my accounts. That was the nail in the coffin. Quentin assured me we had more than enough to take him down. Before we filed the lawsuit, Quentin sent Rod a letter outlining everything we had against him. It was brutal, pages of evidence, bank statements, and affidavits from the facility staff. He didn't hold anything back. The letter gave Rod two options: settle with me privately and return every penny he stole, or face the full force of the law in court. Rod didn't take it well. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, pounding on the door like a madman. When I opened it, he tried to barge in, but I stood my ground. "You're ruining this family," he yelled, his face red with rage. "Do you know what this is going to do to me?" I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I looked him in the eye and said, "You ruined this family the moment you decided to betray me. This is on you." He kept ranting, calling me ungrateful and accusing me of turning everyone against him. I just stood there and let him dig his own grave. Eventually, I told him to leave or I'd call the cops. He stormed off, but I knew he wasn't going to back down easily. Rod refused to settle, so we went to court. The trial was a circus. Rod tried to paint himself as the concerned father who only wanted to help his unstable son. But the evidence spoke for itself. The bank records showed the money trail. The testimonies from the facility staff and Dr. Calder destroyed his claims about my mental health. And when the forged documents were presented, his face went pale. The judge didn't hold back. She called his actions a gross abuse of trust and a calculated effort to exploit his own child. Rod was found guilty of fraud, theft, and forgery. He was ordered to repay every cent he'd stolen, plus damages. The total came out to over $200,000, a number he couldn't possibly afford. But that wasn't the end of it. The criminal charges meant he faced prison time. He ended up with a 5-year sentence, and I made sure everyone in our town knew exactly what he did. His reputation was destroyed. The man who once strutted around like he owned the place was now just a disgraced criminal. With Rod out of the picture, I started rebuilding my life. I moved to Austin to finish my degree and finally had access to the rest of my inheritance. My mom, to my surprise, finally left him. She said the trial had opened her eyes to who he really was. We're not super close, but we're working on it. As for Rod, he's still in prison. I haven't spoken to him since the trial, and I don't plan to. I've made it clear he's not welcome in my life. He sent me a letter once, full of apologies and excuses, but I didn't even bother to read it. I threw it in the trash where it belonged. I made sure Rod's downfall was as public as possible. Everyone in town knew what he did, his friends, his co-workers, even the church folks who used to praise him. His name became a punchline, a cautionary tale about greed and betrayal. He lost his job, his house, and his so-called respectability. And me? I walked away with my money, my freedom, and the satisfaction of knowing he got exactly what he deserved. I don't feel bad for him. Not one bit. He made his choices, and now he's paying for them. As far as I'm concerned, this chapter of my life is closed. I'm free, I'm thriving, and I'll never let anyone take advantage of me again.